Chapter 6. The Grand Lodge Era. Whatever were the origins of the order we now know as Freemasonry, it is clear that during the century preceding its reorganization under Grand Lodge of London, the secret system of binding men together for a common purpose, based on Eastern esoteric doctrines, had been anticipated by the Rosicrucians. Was this secret system employed, however, by any other body of men? It is certainly easy to imagine how in this momentous 17th century, when men of all opinions were coalescing against opposing forces, Lutherans combining against the papacy, Catholics rallying their forces against invading Protestantism, Republicans plotting in favor of Cromwell, Royalists in their turn plotting to restore the Stuarts, finally Royalists plotting against each other on behalf of rival dynasties. An organization of this kind, enabling one to work secretly for a cause and to set invisibly vast numbers of human beings in motion, might prove invaluable to any party. Thus, according to certain Masonic writers on the continent, the system used by the Rosicrucians in their fight against RITE popery was also employed by the Jesuits for a directly opposite purpose. In the manuscripts of the Prince of Hesse published by L'École de Canteleu, it is declared that in 1714 the Jesuits used the mysteries of the Rose-Croix. Mirabeau also relates that the Jesuits profited by the internal troubles of the reign of Charles I to possess themselves of the symbols, the allegories, and the carpets, tapis, of the Rose-Croix Masons, who were only the ancient order of the Templars secretly perpetuated. It may be seen by means of what imperceptible innovations they succeeded in substituting their catechism to the instruction of the Templars. Other continental writers again assert that Cromwell, the arch-opponent of the Catholic Church, was a higher initiate of Masonic mysteries, and used the system for his own elevation to power. Further, that he found himself outdistanced by the Levelers, that this sect, whose name certainly suggests Masonic inspiration, adopted for its symbols the square and compass, and in its claim of real equality threatened the supremacy of the usurper. Finally, Elias Ashmole, the Rosicrucian royalist, is said to have turned the Masonic system against Cromwell, so that towards the end of the 17th century the order rallied to the Stuart cause. But all this is pure speculation resting on no basis of known facts. The accusation that the Jesuits used the system of the Rose-Croix as a cover to political intrigues is referred to by the Rosicrucian Eliphas L66 as the outcome of ignorance, which refutes itself. It is significant to notice that it emanates mainly from Germany, and from the Illuminati. The Prince of Hesse was a member of the Stride Observance and Mirabeau an Illuminatus at the time he wrote the passage quoted above. That in the 17th century certain Jesuits played the part of political intriguers I suppose their warmest friends will hardly deny, but that they employed any secret or Masonic system seems to me perfectly incapable of proof. I shall return to this point later, however, in connection with the Illuminati. As to Cromwell, the only circumstance that lends any color to the possibility of his connection with Freemasonry is his known friendship for Manasseh ben Israel, the colleague of the Rabbi Templo, who designed the coat of arms later adopted by Grand Lodge. If, therefore, the Jews of Amsterdam were a source of inspiration to the Freemasons of the 17th century, it is not impossible that Cromwell may have been the channel through which this influence first penetrated. In the matter of the Stuarts we are, however, on firm ground with regard to Freemasonry. That the lodges at the end of the 17th century were royalist is certain, and there seems good reason to believe that, when the Revolution of 1688 divided the royalist cause, the Jacobites who fled to France with James II took Freemasonry with them. With the help of the French they established lodges in which, it is said, Masonic rites and symbols were used to promote the cause of the Stuarts. Thus the land of promise signified Great Britain, Jerusalem stood for London, and the murder of Hiram represented the execution of Charles I. Meanwhile, Freemasonry in England did not continue to adhere to the Stuart cause, as it had done under the aegis of Elias Ashmole, and by 1717 is said to have become Hanoverian. From this important date the official history of the present system may be said to begin. Hitherto everything rests on stray documents, of which the authenticity is frequently doubtful, and which provide no continuous history of the order. In 1717 for the first time Freemasonry was established on a settled basis, and in the process underwent a fundamental change. So far it would seem to have retained an operative element, but in the transformation that now took place this was entirely eliminated, and the whole order was transformed into a middle and upper-class speculative body. This coup d'état, already suggested in 1703, took place early in 1717, when 4 London lodges of Freemasons met together at the Apple Tree Tavern in Charles Street, Covent Garden, and having put into the chair the oldest Master Mason, being the master of the lodge, they constituted themselves a Grand Lodge, pro tempore, in due form. On St. John the Baptist's Day, June 24th of the same year, the annual assembly and banquet were held at the Goose and Gridiron in St. Paul's Churchyard, when Mr. Anthony Sayer was elected Grand Master and invested with all the badges of office. It is evident from the above account that already in 1717 the speculative elements must have predominated in the lodges. Otherwise we might expect to find the operative Masons taking some part in these proceedings and expressing their opinion as to whether their association should pass under the control of men entirely unconnected with the craft. But no, the leaders of the new movement all appear to have belonged to the middle class, nor from this moment do either Masons or architects seem to have played any prominent part in Freemasonry. But the point that official history does not attempt to elucidate is the reason for this decision. Why should the Freemasons of London, whether they were at this date a speculative or only a semi-speculative association, have suddenly recognized the necessity of establishing a Grand Lodge and drawing up a ritual and constitution? It is evident, then, that some circumstances must have arisen which led them to take this important step. I would suggest that the following may be the solution to the problem. Freemasonry, as we have seen, was a system that could be employed in any cause, and had now come to be used by intriguers of every kind, and not only by intriguers, but by merely convivial bodies, jolly brotherhoods of the bottle who modeled themselves on Masonic associations. But the honest citizens of London who met and feasted at the Goose and Gridiron were clearly not intriguers. They were neither Royalist nor Republican plotters, neither Catholic nor Lutheran fanatics, neither alchemists nor magicians, nor can it be supposed that they were simply revelers. If they were political, they were certainly not supporters of the Stuarts. On the contrary, they were generally reported to have been Hanoverian in their sympathies. Indeed, Dr. Bussell goes so far as to say that Grand Lodge was instituted to support the Hanoverian dynasty. It would be perhaps nearer the truth to conclude that if they were Hanoverian it was because they were constitutional, and the Hanoverian dynasty having now been established they wished to avoid further changes. In a word, then, they were simply men of peace, anxious to put an end to dissensions, who, seeing the system of Masonry utilized for the purpose of promoting discord, determined to wrest it from the hands of political intriguers and restore it to its original character of brotherhood. Though not of brotherhood between working Masons only, but between men drawn from all classes and professions. By founding a Grand Lodge in London and drawing up a ritual and constitutions, they hoped to prevent the perversion of their signs and symbols and to establish the order on a settled basis. According to Nicolai, this specific purpose had already animated English Freemasons under the Grand Mastership of Sir Christopher Wren. Its principal object from this period was to moderate the religious hatreds so terrible in England during the reign of James II, and to try and establish some kind of concord or fraternity, by weakening as far as possible the antagonisms arising from the differences of religions, ranks, and interests. An 18th century manuscript of the Prince of Hesse quoted by Lecatolles de Canteleu expresses the view that in 1717 the mysteries of Freemasonry were reformed and purified in England of all political tendencies. In the matter of religion, Craft Masonry adopted an equally non-sectarian attitude. The first constitutions of the order, drawn up by Dr. Anderson in 1723, contain the following paragraph. Concerning God and religion. A Mason is obliged, by his tenure, to obey the moral law, and if he rightly understands the art, he will never be a stupid atheist, nor an irreligious libertine. But though in ancient times Masons were charged in every country to be of the religion of that country or nation, whatever it was, yet 'tis now thought more expedient only to oblige them to that religion in which all men agree, leaving their particular opinions to themselves, that is to be good men and true, or men of honor and honesty. By whatever denominations or persuasions they may be distinguished, whereby Masonry becomes the center of union, and the means of conciliating true friendship among persons that must have remained at a perpetual distance. The phrase that religion in which all men agree has been censured by Catholic writers as advocating a universal religion in the place of Christianity. But this by no means follows. The idea is surely that Masons should be men adhering to that law of right and wrong common to all religious faiths. Craft Masonry may thus be described as deist in character, but not in the accepted sense of the word, which implies the rejection of Christian doctrines. If Freemasonry had been deist in this sense, might we not expect to find some connection between the founders of Grand Lodge and the school of deists Toland, Bolingbroke, Woolston, Hume, and others which flourished precisely at this period? Might not some analogy be detected between the organization of the order and the sodalities described in Toland's Pantheisticon F published in 1720? But of this I can find no trace whatever. The principal founders of Grand Lodge were, as we have seen, clergymen, both engaged in preaching Christian doctrines at their respective churches. It is surely therefore reasonable to conclude that Freemasonry, at the time of its reorganization in 1717, was deistic only in so far that it invited men to meet together on the common ground of a belief in God. Moreover, some of the early English rituals contained distinctly Christian elements. Thus both in Jachin and Boaz, 1762, and Hiram, or the Grand Master key to the door of both anti-ant and modern Freemasonry by a member of the Royal Arch, 1766, we find prayers in the lodges concluding with the name of Christ. These passages were replaced much later by purely deistic formulas under the Grand Mastership of the free-thinking Duke of Sussex in 1813. But in spite of its innocuous character, Freemasonry, merely by reason of its secrecy, soon began to excite alarm in the public mind. As early as 1724, a work entitled The Grand Mystery of the Freemasons discovered had provoked an angry remonstrance from the Craft Eight, and when the French edict against the order was passed, a letter signed Jachin appeared in the Gentleman's Magazine, declaring the Freemasons, who have lately been suppressed not only in France, but in Holland, to be a dangerous race of men. No government ought to suffer such clandestine assemblies where plots against the state may be carried on, under the pretense of brotherly love and good fellowship. The writer, evidently unaware of possible Templar traditions, goes on to observe that the sentinel placed at the door of the lodge with a drawn sword in his hand is not the only mark of there being a military order, and suggests that the title of Grand Master is taken in imitation of the Knights of Malta. Jachin, moreover, scents a popish plot. They not only admit Turks, Jews, infidels, but even Jacobites, non-jurors and papists themselves. How can we be sure that those persons who are known to be well affected, are let into all their mysteries. They make no scruple to acknowledge that there is a distinction between prentices and master masons, and who knows whether they may not have an higher order of Kabbalists, who keep the grand secret of all entirely to themselves. Later on in France, the Abbé Pound-Perrat published his satires on Freemasonry, Le Secret de Francs-Maçons, 1742, L'Ordre de Francs-Maçons trahit et Le Secret de Mopses Reveal, 1745, and Les Francs-Maçons Graces, 1746. And in about 1761 another English writer, said to be a Mason, brought down a torrent of invective on his head by the publication of the Ritual of the Craft Degrees under the name of Jachin and Boaz J. It must be admitted that from all this controversy no party emerges in a very charitable light, Catholics and Protestants alike indulging in sarcasms and reckless accusations against Freemasonry, the Freemasons retorting with far from brotherly forbearance. But, again, one must remember that all these men were of their age, an age which seen through the eyes of Hogarth would certainly not appear to have been distinguished for delicacy. It should be noted, however, when one reads in Masonic works of the persecutions to which Freemasonry has been subjected, that aggression was not confined only to the one side in the conflict, moreover, that the Freemasons at this period were divided amongst themselves, and expressed with regard to opposing groups much the same suspicions that non-Masons expressed with regard to the order as a whole. For the years following after the suppression of Masonry in France were marked by the most important development in the history of the modern order, the inauguration of the additional degrees. The additional degrees. The origin and inspiration of the additional degrees has provoked hardly less controversy in Masonic circles than the origin of Masonry itself. It should be explained that craft Masonry, or blue Masonry, that is to say, the first 3 degrees of entered apprentice, fellow craft, and master mason, of which I have attempted to trace the history, were the only degrees recognized by Grand Lodge at the time of its foundation in 1717, and still form the basis of all forms of modern Masonry. On this foundation were erected, somewhere between 1740 and 1743, the degree of the Royal Arch, and the first of the series of upper degrees now known as the Scottish Rite, or as the ancient and accepted Rite. The acceptance or rejection of this superstructure has always formed a subject of violent controversy between Masons, one body affirming that craft Masonry is the only true and genuine Masonry, the other declaring that the real object of Masonry is only to be found in the higher degrees. It was this controversy, centering round the Royal Arch degree, that about the middle of the 18th century split Masonry into opposing camps of ancients and modems, the ancients declaring that the RA was the root, heart, and marrow of Freemasonry, the modems rejecting it. Although worked by the ancients from 1756 onwards, this degree was definitely repudiated by Grand Lodge in 1792, and only in 1813 was officially received into English Freemasonry. The RA degree, which is said nevertheless to be contained in embryo in the 1723 Book of Constitutions, is purely Judaic, a glorification of Israel and commemorating the building of the Second Temple. That it was derived from the Jewish Kabbalah seems probable, and Yarka, commenting on the phrase in the Gentleman's Magazine quoted above, who knows whether they, the Freemasons, have not a higher order of Kabbalists, who keep the grand secret of all entirely to themselves, observes, it looks very like an intimation of the Royal Arch degree, and elsewhere he states that the Royal Arch degree, when it had the 3 veils, must have been the work, even if by instruction, of a Kabbalistic Jew about 1740. And from this time we may expect to find a secret tradition grafted upon Anderson's system. Precisely in this same year of 1740 Mr. Waite says that Zero, an itinerant peddler of the Royal Arch degree, is said to have propagated it in Ireland, claiming that it was practiced at York and London. And in 1744 a certain Dr. Dassigny wrote that the minds of the Dublin Brethren had been lately disturbed about Royal Arch-Masonry owing to the activities in Dublin of a number of traders or hucksters in pretended Masonry, whom the writer connects with Italians, or the Italic order. A Freemason quoting this passage in a recent discussion on the upper degrees expresses the opinion that these hucksters were Jacobite emissaries disguised under the form of a pretended Masonry, and that by Italians and Italian order he intends a reference to the court of King James III, i.e. the old pretender at Rome, and to the Ecossaise, Italic, order of Masonry. It is much more likely that he had referred to another source of Masonic instruction in Italy, which I shall indicate in a later chapter. But precisely at the moment when it is suggested that the Jacobites were intriguing to introduce the Royal Arch degree into Masonry, they are also said to have been engaged in elaborating the Scottish Rite. Let us examine this contention. Freemasonry in France. The foundation of Grand Lodge in London had been followed by the inauguration of Masonic lodges on the continent in 1721 at Mons, in 1725 in Paris, in 1728 at Madrid, in 1731 at The Hague, in 1733 at Hamburg, etc. Several of these received their warrant from the Grand Lodge of England. But this was not the case with the Grand Lodge of Paris, which did not receive a warrant till 1743. The men who founded this lodge, far from being non-political, were Jacobite leaders engaged in active schemes for the restoration of the Stuart dynasty. The leader of the group, Charles Ratcliffe, had been imprisoned with his brother, the ill-fated Lord Derwentwater, who was executed on Tower Hill in 1716. Charles had succeeded in escaping from Newgate and made his way to France, where he assumed the title of Lord Derwentwater, although the earldom had ceased to exist under the Bill of Attainder against his brother. It was this Lord Derwentwater afterwards executed for taking part in the 1745 rebellion, who with several other Jacobites, is said to have founded the Grand Lodge of Paris in 1725, and himself to have become Grand Master. The Jacobite character of the Paris Lodge is not a matter of dispute. Mr. Gould relates that the colleagues of Lord Derwentwater are stated to have been a Chevalier Maskelyne, a Squire Hegarty, and others, all partisans of the Stuarts. But he goes on to contest the theory that they used Freemasonry in the Stuart cause, which he regards as amounting to a charge of bad faith. This is surely unreasonable. The founders of Grand Lodge in Paris did not derive from Grand Lodge in London, from which they held no warrant, but, as we have seen, took their Freemasonry with them to France before Grand Lodge of London was instituted. They were therefore in no way bound by its regulations. And until the constitutions of Anderson were published in 1723, no rule had been laid down that the lodges should be non-political. In the old days, Freemasonry had always been royalist, as we see from the ancient charges that members should be true liegemen of the king, and if the adherents of James Edward saw in him their rightful sovereign, they may have conceived that they were using Freemasonry for a lawful purpose in adapting it to this cause. So although we may applaud the decision of the London Freemasons to purge Freemasonry of political tendencies, and transform it into a harmonious system of brotherhood, we cannot accuse the Jacobites in France of bad faith in not conforming to a decision in which they had taken no part, and in establishing lodges on their own lines. Unfortunately, however, as too frequently happens when men form secret confederacies for a wholly honorable purpose, their ranks were penetrated by confederates of another kind. It has been said in an earlier chapter that, according to the documents produced by the Ordre du Temple in the early part of the 19th century, the Templars had never ceased to exist in spite of their official suppression in 1312. And that a line of Grand Masters had succeeded each other in unbroken succession from Jacques du Molay to the Duc de Cosse-Brissac, who was killed in 1792. The Grand Master appointed in 1705 is stated to have been Philippe, du d'Orleans, later the regent. Mr. Waite has expressed the opinion that all this was an invention of the late 18th century, and that the Charter of l'Armenius was fabricated at this date though not published until 1811 by the revived Order du Temple under the Grand Master, Fabre Palaprat. But evidence points to a contrary conclusion. M. Matter, who, as we have seen, disbelieves the story of the Order du Temple, and the authenticity of the Charter of l'Armenius in so far as it professes to be a genuine 14th century document, nevertheless asserts that the savants who have examined it declare it to date from the early part of the 18th century, at which period Matter believes the Gospel of St. John used by the order to have been arranged so as to accompany the ceremonies of some Masonic or secret society. Now, it was about 1740 that a revival of Templarism took place in France and Germany. We cannot therefore doubt that if Matter is right in this hypothesis, the secret society in question was that of the Templars, whether they existed as lineal descendants of the 12th century order, or merely as a revival of that order. The existence of the German Templars at this date under the name of the Stride observance, which we shall deal with in a further chapter, is indeed a fact disputed by no one, but that there was also an Order du Temple in France at the very beginning of the 18th century must be regarded as highly probable. Dr. Mackey, John Yarka, and Lecatolles de Canteleu, who, owing to his possession of Templar documents, had exclusive sources of information, all declare this to have been the case and accept the Charter of l'Armenius as authentic. It is quite certain, says Yarka, that there was at this period in France an Order du Temple, with a charter from Jean-Marc l'Armenius, who claimed appointment from Jacques du Molay. Philippe of Orleans accepted the Grand Mastership in 1705 and signed the statutes. Without, however, necessarily accepting the Charter of l'Armenius as authentic, let us examine the probability of this assertion with regard to the du d'Orleans. Amongst the Jacobites supporting Lord Derwentwater at the Grand Lodge of Paris was a certain Andrew Michael Ramsay, known as Chevalier Ramsay, who was born at Ayr near the famous Lodge of Kilwinning, where the Templars are said to have formed their alliance with the Masons in 1314. In 1710 Ramsay was converted to the Roman Catholic faith by Fenelon, and in 1724 became tutor to the sons of the Pretender at Rome. Mr. Gould has related that during his stay in France, Ramsay had formed a friendship with the regent, Philippe du d'Orleans, who was Grand Master of the Order de Saint-Lazare, instituted during the Crusades as a body of hospitallers devoting themselves to the care of the lepers, and which in 1608 had been joined to the Order du Mont Carmel. It seems probable from all accounts that Ramsay was a chevalier of this order, but he cannot have been admitted into it by the du d'Orleans, for the Grand Master of the Order de Saint-Lazare was not the du d'Orleans, but the Marquis de Dangeau, who on his death in 1720 was succeeded by the son of the regent, the Duc de Chartres. If, then, Ramsay was admitted to any order by the regent, it was surely the Order du Temple, of which the regent is said to have been the Grand Master at this date. Now, the infamous character of the du d'Orleans is a matter of common knowledge. Moreover, during the Regency, that period of impiety and moral dissolution hitherto unparalleled in the history of France, the chief of council was the Duc de Bourbon, who later placed his mistress the Marquise de Prie, and the financier Paris Duvernay at the head of affairs, thus creating a scandal of such magnitude that he was exiled in 1726 through the influence of Cardinal Fleury. This Duc de Bourbon in 1737 is said to have become Grand Master of the Temple. It was thus, observes de Canteleu, that these two Grand Masters of the Temple degraded the royal authority and ceaselessly increased hatred against the government. It would therefore seem strange that a man so upright as Ramsay appears to have been, who had moreover but recently been converted to the Catholic Church, should have formed a friendship with the dissolute regent of France, unless there had been some bond between them. But here we have a possible explanation: Templarism. Doubtless during Ramsay's youth at Kilwinning many Templar traditions had come to his knowledge, and if in France he found himself befriended by the Grand Master himself, what wonder that he should have entered into an alliance which resulted in his admission to an order he had been accustomed to revere and which, moreover, was represented to him as the fons et origo of the Masonic Brotherhood to which he also belonged. It is thus that we find Ramsay in the very year that the Duc de Bourbon is said to have been made Grand Master of the Temple artlessly writing to Cardinal Fleury asking him to extend his protection to the Society of Freemasons in Paris, and enclosing a copy of the speech which he was to deliver on the following day, March 21, 1737. It is in this famous oration that for the first time we find Freemasonry traced to the Crusades. At the time of the Crusades in Palestine many princes, lords, and citizens associated themselves, and vowed to restore the temple of the Christians in the Holy Land, and to employ themselves in bringing back their architecture to its first institution. They agreed upon several ancient signs and symbolic words drawn from the well of religion, in order to recognize themselves amongst the heathens and Saracens. These signs and words were only communicated to those who promised solemnly, and even sometimes at the foot of the altar, never to reveal them. This sacred promise was therefore not an execrable oath, as it has been called, but a respectable bond to unite Christians of all nationalities into one confraternity. Some time afterwards our order formed an intimate union with the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem. From that time our lodges took the name of Lodges of St. John. This speech of Ramsay's has raised a storm of controversy amongst Freemasons, because it contains a very decided hint of a connection between Templarism and Freemasonry. Mr. Tuckett, in the paper referred to above, points out that only the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem are here mentioned, but Ramsay distinctly speaks of our order forming a union with the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem, and we know that the Templars did eventually form such a union. The fact that Ramsay does not mention the Templars by name admits of a very plausible explanation. It must be remembered that, as Mr. Gould has shown, a copy of the oration was enclosed by Ramsay in his letter to Cardinal Fleury appealing for royal protection to be extended to Freemasonry. It is therefore hardly likely that he would have proclaimed a connection between the order he was anxious to present in the most favorable light and one which had formerly been suppressed by king and pope. Moreover, if the charter of L'Armenius is to be believed, the newly elected Grand Master of the Temple was the Duc de Bourbon, who had already incurred the cardinal's displeasure. Obviously, therefore, Templar influence was best kept in the background. This is not to imply bad faith on the part of Ramsay, who doubtless held the order of Templars to be wholly praiseworthy, but he could not expect the king or cardinal to share his view, and therefore held it more prudent to refer to the progenitors of Freemasonry under the vague description of a crusading body. Ramsay's well-meant effort met, however, with no success. Whether on account of this unlucky reference by which the cardinal may have detected Templar influence, or for some other reason, the appeal for royal protection was not only refused, but the new order, which hitherto Catholics had been allowed to enter, was now prohibited by royal edict. In the following year, 1738, the Pope, Clement XII, issued a bull in eminenti, banning Freemasonry and excommunicating Catholics who took part in it. But this prohibition appears to have been without effect, for Freemasonry not only prospered, but soon began to manufacture new degrees. And in the Masonic literature of the following 30 years the Templar tradition becomes still more clearly apparent. Thus the Chevalier de Barrage in a well-known pamphlet, of which the first edition is said to have appeared in 1747, gives the following account of the origins of Freemasonry. This order was instituted by Godefroy de Bouillon in Palestine in 1330, after the decadence of the Christian armies, and was only communicated to the French Masons some time after and to a very small number. As a reward for the obliging services they rendered to several of our English and Scottish knights, from whom true Masonry is taken. Their metropolitan lodge is situated on the mountain of Heerdam, where the first lodge was held in Europe, and which exists in all its splendor. The General Council is still held there, and it is the seal of the Sovereign Grand Master in office. This mountain is situated between the west and north of Scotland at 60 miles from Edinburgh. Apart from the historical confusion of the first sentence, this passage is of interest as evidence that the theory of a connection between certain crusading knights and the Lodge of Heerdam of Kilwinning was current as early as 1747. The Baron Scouty in his Étoile Flamboyante, which appeared in 1766, says that the crusading origin of Freemasonry is the one officially taught in the lodges, where candidates for initiation are told that several knights who had set forth to rescue the holy places of Palestine from the Saracens formed an association under the name of Freemasons, thus indicating that their principal desire was the reconstruction of the Temple of Solomon. That, further, they adopted certain signs, grips, and passwords as a defense against the Saracens, and finally that our society fraternized on the footing of an order with the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem, from which it is apparent that the Freemasons borrowed the custom of regarding St. John as the patron of the whole order in general. After the Crusades the Masons kept their rites and methods, and in this way perpetuated the royal art by establishing lodges, first in England, then in Scotland, etc. In this account, therefore, Freemasonry is represented as having been instituted for the defense of Christian doctrines. De Barrage expresses the same view and explains that the object of these crusaders in thus binding themselves together was to protect their lives against the Saracens by enveloping their sacred doctrines in a veil of mystery. For this purpose they made use of Jewish symbolism, which they invested with a Christian meaning. Thus the Temple of Solomon was used to denote the Church of Christ, the bough of acacia signified the cross, the square and the compass the union between the Old and New Testaments, etc. So the mysteries of Masonry were in their principle, and are still, nothing else than those of the Christian religion. Baron Scouty, however, declares that all this stops short of the truth, that Freemasonry originated long before the Crusades in Palestine, and that the real ancestors, fathers, authors of the Masons, those illustrious men of whom I will not say the date nor betray the secret, were a disciplined body whom Scouty describes by the name of the Knights of the Aurora and Palestine. After the almost total destruction of the Jewish people, these knights had always hoped to regain possession of the domains of their fathers and to rebuild the temple. And they carefully preserved their regulations and particular liturgy, together with a sublime treatise, which was the object of their continual study and of their philosophical speculations. Scouty further relates that they were students of the occult sciences, of which alchemy formed a part, and that they had abjured the principles of the Jewish religion in order to follow the lights of the Christian faith. At the time of the Crusades the Knights of Palestine came out from the desert of the Thebaid, where they had remained hidden, and joined to themselves some of the Crusaders who had remained in Jerusalem. Declaring that they were the descendants of the Masons who had worked on the Temple of Solomon, they professed to concern themselves with speculative architecture, which served to disguise a more glorious point of view. From this time they took the name of Freemasons, presented themselves under this title to the crusading armies, and assembled under their banners. It would of course be absurd to regard any of the foregoing accounts as historical facts. The important point is that they tend to prove the fallacy of supposing that the Johannite Templar theory originated with the revived Order du Temple, since one corresponding to it so closely was current in the middle of the preceding century. It is true that in these earlier accounts the actual words Johannite and Templar do not occur. But the resemblance between the sect of Jews professing the Christian faith, but possessing a particular liturgy, and a sublime treatise apparently some early form of the Kabbalah dealing with occult science, and the Mandeans, or Johannites with their Kabbalistic Book of Adam, their Book of John, and their ritual, is at once apparent. Further, the allusions to the connection between the knights who had been indoctrinated in the Holy Land and the Scottish lodges coincides exactly with the Templar tradition, published not only by the Order du Temple, but handed down in the Royal Order of Scotland. From all this the following facts stand out. 1. That whilst British craft masonry traced its origin to the operative guilds of masons, the Freemasons of France from 1737 onwards placed the origin of the order in crusading chivalry. 2. That it was amongst these Freemasons that the upper degrees known as the Scottish Rite arose, and 3. That, as we shall now see, these degrees clearly suggest Templar inspiration. The earliest form of the upper degrees appears to have been the one given by de Barrage, as follows. 1. Parfait Magan Elu. 2. Pound Lou de Perignon. 3. Pound Lou de Quins. 4. Petit Architect. 5. Grand Architect. 6. Chevalier d'Arpound P6 EET de Rosecroix. 7. Nochite au Chevalier Prussian. The first of these to make its appearance is believed to have been the one here assigned to the 6th place. This degree, known in modern masonry as Prince of the Rose-Croix of Hierdam, or Knight of the Pelican and Eagle, became the 18th, and the most important degree, in what was later called the Scottish Rite, or at the present time in England the ancient and accepted Rite. Why was this rite called Scottish? It cannot be too strongly insisted on, says Mr. Gould, that all Scottish masonry has nothing whatever to do with the Grand Lodge of Scotland, nor, with one possible exception, that of the Royal Order of Scotland, did it ever originate in that country. But in the case of the Rose-Croix degree there is surely some justification for the term and legend, if not in proven fact, for, as we have already seen, according to the tradition of the Royal Order of Scotland, this degree had been contained in it since the 14th century, when the degrees of HRM, Hierdam, and RSYCS, Rosy Cross, are said to have been instituted by Robert Bruce in collaboration with the Templars after the Battle of Bannockburn. Dr. Mackey is one of the few Masons who admit this probable affiliation, and in referring to the tradition of the Royal Order of Scotland observes, "From that order it seems to us by no means improbable that the present degree of Rose-Croix de Hierdam may have taken its origin." But the Rose-Croix degree, like the Templar tradition from which it appears to have descended, is capable of a dual interpretation, or rather of a multiple interpretation, for no degree in Masonry has been subject to so many variations. That on the continent it had descended through the Rosicrucians in an alchemical form seems more than probable. It would certainly be difficult to believe that a degree of RSYCS was imported from the East and incorporated in the Royal Order of Scotland in 1314, that by a mere coincidence a man named Christian Rosenkreutz was, according to the Rosicrucian legend, BOM in the same century and transmitted a secret doctrine he had discovered in the East to the 17th century Brethren of the Rosy Cross, and finally, that a degree of the Rose-Croix was founded in circ. 1741 without any connection existing between these succeeding movements. Even if we deny direct affiliation, we must surely admit a common source of inspiration producing, if not a continuation, at any rate a periodic revival of the same ideas. Dr. Oliver indeed admits affiliation between the 17th century fraternity and the 18th century degree, and after pointing out that the first indication of the Rose-Croix degree appears in the Fama Fraternitatis in 1613, goes on to say, "It was known much sooner, although not probably as a degree in Masonry, for it existed as a Kabbalistic science from the earliest times in Egypt, Greece, and Rome, as well as amongst the Jews and Moors in times more recent, and in our own country the names of Roger Bacon, Flood, Ashmole, and many others are found in its list of adepts." Dr. Mackey, quoting this passage, observes that Oliver confounds the Masonic Rose-Croix with the alchemical Rosicrucians, and proceeds to give an account of the Rose-Croix degree as worked in England and America, which he truly describes as in the strictest sense a Christian degree, but the point Dr. Mackey overlooks is that this is only one version of the degree, which, as we shall see later, has been and still is worked in a very different manner on the continent. It is, however, certain that the version of the Rose-Croix degree first adopted by the Freemasons of France in about 1741 was not only so Christian, but so Catholic in character, as to have given rise to the belief that it was devised by the Jesuits in order to counteract the attacks of which Catholicism was the object. In a paper on the additional degrees, Mr. J. S. Tuckett writes, "There is undeniable evidence that in their earliest forms the Écossais, or Scots degrees, were Roman Catholic. I have a MS ritual in French of what I believe to be the original Chef d'Aigle or SPDRC, Souverain Prince de Rose-Croix, and in it the new law is declared to be La Foi Catholique, and the Baron Scouty in his L'Etoile Flamboyant of 1766 describes the same degree as Le Catholicisme mise en grade, volume I. p. 1x4. I suggest that Écossais or Scots Masonry was intended to be a Roman Catholic, as well as a Stuart form of Freemasonry, into which none but those devoted to both restorations were to be admitted. But is it necessary to read this political intention into the degree? If the tradition of the Royal Order of Scotland is to be believed, the idea of the Rose-Croix degree was far older than the Stuart cause, and dated back to Bannockburn, when the degree of heirdom with which it was coupled was instituted in order to correct the errors and reform the abuses which had crept in among the 3 degrees of St. John's Masonry, and to provide a Christianized form of the 3rd degree, purified of the dross of paganism, and even of Judaism. Whether the antiquity attributed to these degrees can be proved or not, it certainly appears probable that the legend of the Royal Order of Scotland had some foundation in fact, and therefore that the ideas embodied in the 18th century Rose-Croix degree may have been drawn from the store of that order, and brought by the Jacobites to France. At the same time, there is no evidence in support of the statement, made by certain continental writers, that Ramsay actually instituted this, or any of the upper degrees. On the contrary, in his oration he expressly states that Freemasonry is composed of the craft degrees only. We have amongst us 3 kinds of brothers: novices or apprentices, fellows or professed brothers, masters or perfected brethren. To the first are explained the moral virtues, to the second the heroic virtues, to the last the Christian virtues. It might be said then that the Rose-Croix degree was here foreshadowed in the master's degree, in that the latter definitely inculcated Christianity. This would be perfectly in accord with Ramsay's point of view, as set forth in his account of his conversion by Fenelon. When he first met the Archbishop of Cambrai in 1710, Ramsay relates that he had lost faith in all Christian sects, and had resolved to take refuge in a wise deism limited to respect for the divinity, and for the immutable ideas of pure virtue. But that his conversation with Fenelon led him to accept the Catholic faith. And he goes on to show that Monsieur de Cambrai turned atheists into deists, deists into Christians, and Christians into Catholics by a sequence of ideas full of enlightenment and feeling. Might not this be the process which Ramsay aimed at introducing into Freemasonry, the process which in fact does form part of the Masonic system in England today, where the atheist must become, at least by profession, a deist before he can be admitted to the craft degrees, whilst the Rose-Croix degree is reserved solely for those who profess the Christian faith. Such was undoubtedly the idea of the men who introduced the Rose-Croix degree into France, and Ragan, who gives an account of this Ancienne Rose-Croix Francis, which is almost identical with the degree now worked in England, but long since abandoned in France, objects to it on the very score of its Christian character. In this respect the Rose-Croix amongst all the upper degrees introduced to France in the middle of the 18th century stands alone, and it alone can with any probability be attributed to Scottish Jacobite inspiration. It was not, in fact, until 3 or 4 years after Lord Derwentwater, or his mysterious successor Lord Harnewester, had resigned the Grand Mastership in favor of the Duc d'Antin in 1738, that the additional degrees were first heard of. And it was not until 8 years after the Stuart cause had received its death blow at Culloden, that is to say, in 1754, that the Rite of Perfection, in which the so-called Scots degrees were incorporated, was drawn up in the following form. Rite of Perfection. 1. Entered Apprentice. 2. Fellow Craft. 3. Master Mason. 4. Secret Master. 5. Perfect Master. 6. Intimate Secretary. 7. Intendant of the Buildings. 8. Provost and Judge. 9. Elect of 9. 10. Elect of 15. 11. Chief of the 12 Tribes. 12. Grand Master Architect. 13. Knight of the 9th Arch. 14. Ancient Grand Elect. 15. Knight of the Sword. 16. Prince of Jerusalem. 17. Knight of the East and West. 18. Rose-Croix Knight. 19. Grand Pontiff. 20. Grand Patriarch. 21. Grand Master of the Key of Masonry. 22. Prince of Libanus or Knight of the Royal Axe. 23. Sovereign Prince Adept. 24. Commander of the Black and White Eagle. 25. Commander of the Royal Secret. We have only to glance at the nomenclature of the last 22 of these degrees to see that on the basis of mere operative masonry there has been built up a system composed of 2 elements, crusading chivalry and Judaic tradition. What else is this but Templarism? Even Mr. Gould, usually so reticent on Templar influence, admits it at this period. In France, some of the Scots lodges would appear to have very early manufactured new degrees, connecting these very distinguished Scots Masons with the Knights Templar, and thus given rise to the subsequent flood of Templarism. The earliest of all are supposed to have been the Masons of Lyons, who invented the Kadosh degree, representing the vengeance of the Templars, in 1741. From that time new rites multiplied in France and Germany, but all those of French origin contain knightly, and almost all, Templar grades. In every case the connecting link was composed of 1 or more Scots degrees. The name Kadosh here mentioned is a Hebrew word signifying holy or consecrated, which in the Kabbalah is found in conjunction with the Tetragrammaton. The degree is said to have developed from that of Grand Elect, one of the 3 degrees of vengeance, celebrating with sanguinary realism the avenging of the murder of Hiram. But in its final form of Night Kadosh later, to become the 30th degree of the ancient and accepted Scottish rite, the Hiramic legend was changed into the history of the Templars with Jacques du Molay as the victim. So the reprobation of attack on authority personified by the master builder becomes approbation of attack on authority in the person of the King of France. The introduction of the upper degrees with their political and, later on, anti-Christian tendencies thus marked a complete departure from the fundamental principle of Freemasonry, that nothing concerning the religion or government shall ever be spoken of in the lodge. For this reason they have been assailed not only by anti-Masonic writers, but by Freemasons themselves. To represent Berulle and Robeson as the enemies of Freemasonry is therefore absolutely false. Neither of these men denounced craft masonry as practiced in England, but only the superstructure erected on the continent. Berulle indeed incurs the reproaches of Mounier for his championship of English Freemasons. He vaunts their respect for religious opinion and for authority. When he speaks of Freemasons in general, they are impious, rebellious successors of the Templars and Albigenses, but all those of England are innocent. More than this, all the entered apprentices, fellow crafts, and master masons in all parts of the world are innocent. There are only guilty ones in the higher degrees, which are not essential to the institution, and are sought by a small number of people. In this opinion of Berulle's a great number of Masonic writers concur. Clavel, Ragan, Rabold, Thory, Findel, and others too numerous to mention, all indicate craft masonry as the only true kind, and the upper degrees as constituting a danger to the order. Rabold, who gives a list of these writers, quotes a Masonic publication, authorized by the Grand Orient and the Supreme Council of France, in which it is said that from all these rites there result the most foolish conceptions, the most absurd legends, the most extravagant systems, the most immoral principles, and those the most dangerous for the peace and preservation of states, and that therefore except the first 3 degrees of Masonry, which are really ancient and universal, everything is chimera, extravagance, futility, and lies. Did Berulle and Robeson ever use stronger language than this? To attribute the perversion of Masonry to Jacobite influence would be absurd. How could it be supposed that either Ramsay or Lord Derwentwater, who died as a devout Catholic on the scaffold in 1746, could have been concerned in an attempt to undermine the Catholic faith or the monarchy of France? I would suggest, then, that the term Scots Masonry became simply a veil for Templarism, moreover, of a very different kind to that from which the original degree of the Rose-Croix was derived. It was this so-called Scots Masonry that, after the resignation of Lord Derwentwater, boldly came forward and claimed to be not merely a part of Masonry, but the real Masonry, possessed of superior knowledge and entitled to greater privileges and the right to rule over the ordinary, i.e. craft masonry. The Grand Lodge of France seems, however, to have realized the danger of submitting to the domination of the Templar element, and on the death of the Duc d'Antin, and his replacement by the Comte de Clermont in 1743, signified its adherence to English craft masonry by proclaiming itself Grande Loge Anglaise de France, and reissued the Constitutions of Anderson, first published in 1723, with the injunction that the Scots masters should be placed on the same level as the simple apprentices and fellow crafts, and allowed to wear no badges of distinction. Grand Lodge of England appears to have been reassured by this proclamation as to the character of Freemasonry, for it was now, in 1743, that it at last delivered a warrant to Grand Lodge of France. Yet in reality it was from this moment that French Freemasonry degenerated the most rapidly. The order was soon invaded by intriguers. This was rendered all the easier by the apathy of the Comte de Clermont, appointed Grand Master in 1743, who seems to have taken little interest in the order, and employed a substitute in the person of a dancing master named Lecorne, a man of low character through whose influence the lodges fell into a state of anarchy. Freemasonry was thus divided into warring factions. Lecorne and the crowd of low-class supporters who had followed him into the lodges founded a Grand Lodge of their own, Grande Loge Lecorne. And in 1756 the original Freemasons again attempted to make craft masonry the national masonry of France by deleting the word Anglaise from the appellation of Grand Lodge and renaming it Grande Loge Nationale de France. But many lodges still continue to work the additional degrees. The rivalry between the two groups became so violent that in 1767 the government intervened and closed down Grand Lodge. The Templar group had, however, formed two separate associations, the Knights of the East, 1756, and the Council of the Emperors of the East and West, 1758. In 1761 a Jew named Stephen Morin was sent to America by the emperors armed with a warrant from the Duc de Clermont and Grand Lodge of Paris, and bearing the sonorous title of Grand Elect Perfect and Sublime Master, with orders to establish a lodge in that country. In 1766 he was accused in Grand Lodge of propagating strange and monstrous doctrines, and his patent of Grand Inspector was withdrawn. Morin, however, had succeeded in establishing the rite of perfection. 16 inspectors, nearly all Jews, were now appointed. These included Isaac Long, Isaac da Costa, Moses Hayes B. Spitzer, Moses Cohen, Abraham Jacobs, and Hyman Long. Meanwhile in France the closing of Grand Lodge had not prevented meetings of Lecorne's group, which, on the death of the Duc de Clermont in 1772, instituted the Grand Orient with the Duc de Chartres the future Philippe Égalité as Grand Master. The Grand Orient then invited the Grande Loge to revoke the decree of expulsion and unite with it, and this offer being accepted, the Revolutionary Party inevitably carried all before it, and the Duc de Chartres was declared Grand Master of all the councils, chapters, and Scotch lodges of France. In 1782 the Council of Emperors and the Knights of the East combined to form the Grand Chapter General de France, which in 1786 joined up with the Grand Orient. The victory of the Revolutionary Party was then complete. It is necessary to enter into all these tedious details in order to understand the nature of the factions grouped together under the banner of Masonry at this period. The Martinist Papus attributes the revolutionary influences that now prevailed in the lodges to their invasion by the Templars, and goes on to explain that this was owing to a change that had taken place in the Ordre du Temple. Under the Grand Mastership of the Regent and his successor the Duc de Bourbon, the revolutionary elements amongst the Templars had had full play, but from 1741 onwards the Grand Masters of the Order were supporters of the monarchy. When the Revolution came, the Duc de Cosse-Brissac, who had been Grand Master since 1776, perished amongst the defenders of the throne. It was thus that by the middle of the century the Order of the Temple ceased to be a revolutionary force, and the discontented elements it had contained, no longer able to find in it a refuge, threw themselves into Freemasonry, and entering the higher degrees turned them to their subversive purpose. According to Papus, Lecorne was a member of the Templar group, and the dissensions that took place were principally a fight between the ex-Templars and the genuine Freemasons which ended in the triumph of the former. Victorious rebels thus founded the Grand Orient of France. So a contemporary Mason is able to write, It is not excessive to say that the Masonic Revolution of 1773 was the prelude and the precursor of the Revolution of 1789. What must be well observed is the secret action of the Brothers of the Templar Rite. It is they who are the real fomenters of revolution, the others are only docile agents. But all this attributes the baneful influence of Templarism to the French Templars alone, and the existence of such a body rests on no absolutely certain evidence. What is certain and admits of no denial on the part of any historian is the inauguration of a Templar order in Germany at the very moment when the so-called Scottish degrees were introduced into French Masonry. We shall now return to 1738 and follow events that were taking place at this important moment beyond the Rhine.